Hello everyone, my name is Dominic O'Brien. I'm a lecturer in anatomy at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, and I've been invited here today to talk to you about the role of virtual dissection in anatomy education. So talking about kind of what virtual dissection is, how it's being implemented currently in anatomy education, potential future applications of it, where it might be going as an educational tool, including how it's being utilised or could potentially be utilised as a method for surgical training courses as well. So just to give you a little bit of an outline of the talk as we're going to go through. First of all, I'm going to talk about what virtual dissection actually is, just because I don't want to presume that you've all got the same level of experience with it. So we're going to talk about what it actually is, how it's implemented, the different methodologies behind it, the different services available for virtual dissection, how it's being utilised in medical education in different institutions, talking a little bit about why it's even a thought or even an option, why you should or maybe shouldn't be using virtual dissection for your teaching needs, and then lastly you're going to be looking at how it can be transferred even further into that kind of higher level of surgical training. So just a quick disclaimer to begin with. I will be talking about specific apps and other sorts of services that provide the opportunity for virtual dissection, but I'm not professionally affiliated with them in any way. It's only from my own experience in using these services. I don't own shares, I'm not getting any sort of financial incentives from talking about them. It's simply just throughout my career in teaching, what I have used and kind of how I have found using them as a teaching resource. So this will be tainted with my own opinions and my own experiences, so do just take that with a pinch of salt, as it were. I inherently have preferences to the different apps and services that are available, and that may come across as I'm describing them, and that may be entirely different for you and your experiences. So I'll try and be as unbiased as possible, but just from my own experiences, I will be talking a little bit about how I have found teaching with them personally, some of their benefits and drawbacks as far as my own experiences go, but that is just my own experience. So first of all, what even is virtual dissection? It's a fairly new and up-and-coming technology that's slowly being integrated more and more into more institutions' curriculum as it becomes a lot more available. So at its very basic premise, what it is the use of software to emulate the cadaveric dissection experience. So using either apps or software in a way that's just going to give you a similar experience to the wet dissection, which a lot of medical schools do still use. This is actually kind of being extended even further now, and there's actually extended reality options. So this extended reality is just more of an umbrella term talking about virtual and augmented reality. And we'll talk a little bit about those in a second, just in case you're not clear on the differentiation between the two. But when we're talking about virtual dissection, all we're talking about is giving a dissection experience through the use of software, some sort of virtual experience, removing any cadaveric specimens or animal specimens, any physical anatomical specimens. So just so that we're all on the same page as far as extended reality goes, because this will feature a little bit more heavily as we get into the different options, virtual reality is the type of extended reality where, as you can see on the top right here, we have an individual wearing a virtual reality headset. You may well have seen these. They're becoming very common now, even just as a personal leisure item for consuming films, other media and games and the like. Basically, virtual reality pertains to the fact that you are replacing that individual's field of vision and perceived reality with whatever software you are providing them with, which is why this entire headset is entirely enclosed. There is no way that they can see through these headsets, so the visuals that are projected onto the screens within that headset are fully immersive. basically in creating that new environment for the user. Whereas augmented reality is basically layered images, models, and the like on top of an individual's vision. So you can see on the right here we have someone with an augmented reality headset, which you can see at the front here has entirely clear lenses. So they can still see their surroundings perfectly clearly, but projections will be made onto this screen, so it will basically look like their reality has additions to it. So the models, images, things like that will be added into their environment rather than it being a entirely self-contained new environment for them to inhabit. So there are many, many different ways that virtual dissection can be utilised now. It's becoming a very popular area of innovation, especially as education moves to be a bit more technologically minded. So there's applications that can be used, simple Android, iOS apps. The most popular, or the ones that I have had most kind of experience with, are Complete Anatomy, which here's the icon for that, and then Anatomy TV, which is provided by Primal Pictures. These two are very similar. Basically, they are able to be used on phones and tablets and computers. There's even web browser versions of these. Basically, giving you access to complete three-dimensional models of human anatomy that can be kind of manipulated and explored, and give you that virtual dissection experience. Going one step further than that, there's full kind of larger pieces of equipment that can be purchased to give that experience, such as the Anatomage table, which you can see an image of down here in the bottom right. So you can see this group of students using this piece of equipment, which is the Anatomage table, which is basically one of the only ways to actually interact with the Anatomage software, which you can see on the screen here. This is basically an incredibly large touchscreen computer that's being used to run the Anatomage software. And then there's the VR and AR options. So these tend to get kind of lumped together just because of that kind of reality altering, more immersive experience. So there's options such as 3D Organon seems to be one of the more popular ones, which I've had a very brief experience of. But there's also other options such as VR Anatomy, and many of these are available. A quick Google search will show you a myriad of other options, as well as kind of one of the slightly newer, more niche areas that VR and AR virtual dissection can be used is by live streaming video. And that's something that we'll talk about towards the end when we're looking at how this virtual dissection experience can be transitioned into a teaching or learning or training experience for new surgeons. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time now and talk through some of the different options for the virtual dissection experiences, talk about how I have found using them, give you some of the kind of the benefits and the drawbacks, just so that you can at least see contextually how or why you might want to incorporate these into your teaching for whatever reason. So firstly, Complete Anatomy is probably the one that I have by far the most experience with. I use this routinely in my teaching at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, and used it fairly regularly in my previous post at Birmingham Medical School as well. Complete Anatomy is simply an application that you can download to your phone or tablet. There is a free trial which you can download and try for yourselves. So you can get an idea of how it's utilised. It doesn't really need a powerful phone or tablet to be able to run. It's actually a very compact kind of software experience as it is. It's incredibly rich in features, it really is. So you can see that I've just kind of included the an image here. So this is just the home screen. So once you've downloaded the app, it does require a yearly subscription, which for students is discounted. So for students, it costs around £60 per year. Educators, I believe it's around £80 per year. There are also institutional licenses which can be purchased, which is something that we do at Brighton and Sussex. So you can see up in here, this is basically just to signify that I have redeemed my institution's license, which is what gives me access to this this software, or at least the full version of the software. So you can see some of the options that we have here and just how kind of wide-ranging it is. So one of the main things that it is kind of used for is if we see the models section here, basically that is what will open up the entirety of the 3D model of the human body that you will then have access to, which is incredibly detailed. There is kind of all the anatomy you could possibly want to know in these models, and you are able to explore this entirely freely. You can add and remove structures as you see fit. You can hide different systems, populate different systems, and I've got a screenshot from within the app that I'll show you in a moment, so you can just see how robust and how detailed the software actually is. As well, it includes its own content baked into the Complete Anatomy platform, so you can see that we have kind of a content option here. We have courses and videos and radiology options. So these different areas basically already contain lectures, activities, case studies that are already available once you have subscribed to the license for the app. So there is already a wealth of content actually within the platform, which can be used for students to learn slightly more clinically linked anatomy, kind of applying that to clinical scenarios, but also can just be helpful in kind of planning your own teaching sessions. It will help to give you more of an idea of maybe certain areas of anatomy, or ways to explain certain areas of anatomy that might be quite difficult. Or as well, something I quite enjoy doing is trying to incorporate more clinical scenarios and more clinically leaning viewpoints into my teaching, as at the end of the day, personally, I am training medics, and I think it's a lot more engaging if we can give them kind of that more clinical spin and kind of make the anatomy that they're learning feel a bit more applicable to kind of that career that they're striving for. As well, down here we have the curriculum manager option, which is where you can basically build your own curriculum within the Complete Anatomy app. You can add your own lectures, your own talks, your own activities built within the app. You can create your own kind of bespoke models. So if you only want students to be able to concentrate on certain structures within the head and neck, for example, you can create a model, remove all the unnecessary structures that they maybe don't need to learn just yet, or would kind of obscure the more important landmarks or structures, and then make that available to them, and they can access that through the curriculum manager option. So it's incredibly versatile and just gives you a lot of options really for kind of emboldening your teaching materials. And then on the right here we have just an example of the model that's available within the app. So what I've done here is I've basically, you can see at the bottom, we have the various different options for systems. Unfortunately it's just been cut off ever so slightly. So you can see we have the skeletal, connective tissues, muscular, arterial and venous, and you can see it goes on and on. And basically you can turn these systems on or off. So here you can see that I have the skeletal system, the muscular system, arterial, venous, and the nervous system. That one says nervous. So I've got all of those systems visible, and then these little blue circles here signify that I've removed certain structures. So you can see that I've removed the frontal bone here from the left side of the model, as well as the parietal bone and temporal bone, and then the dural layers and the deeper meningeal layers as well, and some of the blood vessels, basically just so that I can show the actual cerebrum itself. And that's what's really quite enjoyable, I guess, about using this software, is that you can really tailor it to what you are trying to teach and give your students kind of the most obvious kind of representations of the anatomy, and really show to them where these structures are, what they look like, and how they're related to other surrounding structures. And you can see here we have this vein highlighted in pink which has been kind of surrounded by the adjoining veins. That means that I've selected that structure, and then you can see on the right here, it tells you exactly what that structure is, and then gives you almost like a textbook blurb about that structure. And this is, again, one of the massive strengths about this app, is that the level of detail is so dense, it's so concise. There is an awful lot to be able to be accessed within here. And you can see over here as well, there's the tools option. This will allow you to cut away certain areas of anatomy. It will give you pen tools so that you can draw on either two-dimensionally or three-dimensionally onto the model. Just kind of helps you to then point out either to students, or if you're a student and learning, it will help you to make notes on the different areas of anatomy. But some of the drawbacks of this app, it's by far not perfect. It might be my favourite, but it's not perfect in the least. So the images aren't cadaveric. These are all kind of computer rendered images. So they aren't the most accurate that you would expect to see in true human anatomy. Again, this is one of the things I'm going to keep coming back to with a lot of the virtual dissection options, is that a lot of them do not have cadaveric images within them. So you are missing some of that level of accuracy that you will see with a lot of actual cadaveric specimens or anatomical specimens and things like that. It also lacks a sense of scale. So this was taken as a screenshot from my personal tablet. It's a 12-inch tablet, nothing super special or fancy, but it's very difficult to get the level of scale of that area of anatomy as it would be in a human being. Basically, because it can be zoomed in and out, it's great that you can actually get in to the anatomy up close and see all of these really minute structures. However, that does mess with the sense of scale and the spacing between them, and just kind of that general three-dimensional spatial awareness of the anatomy is something that might suffer slightly using these virtual anatomy softwares when compared to a more involved dissection of the anatomy. So then moving on here, we're going to have a look at the Anatomage system. So I'm just going to let this video play. This is basically just almost like an advertisement for the Anatomage software. So as you can see here, the images that are available on the Anatomage table are actually cadaveric scans. So this was utilised as part of the visible body project, so you can see that they're much more true to life as far as the anatomy goes, much more accurate, and I guess much closer to what you would be wanting students to be able to see were they conducting cadaveric dissection. Again, this software, incredibly rich. You can see the amount of options that you have for kind of adding and removing the anatomy, similarly to you'd have from Complete, but all of this is actually true cadaveric images. These are taken from the Visible Body Project, so you will get much better representation of human anatomy with this software. They're incredibly high resolution, so you can, as you will have seen in some of the previous images on here, you can zoom in incredibly closely and still maintain that level of quality of these images, and you can see how detailed the musculature, the connective tissues, and everything is. It's really incredibly impressive as a resource, and I think it's probably about as close as you can get to a true dissection experience, but virtually. So as you could see, it's kind of administered in this large tablet format. So this table, as you can see here, that is how you have access to the Anatomage software. It's one massive touchscreen. It's actually two televisions kind of spliced together. As you can see, there's the barrier there between the two. Entirely interactive, so you can just utilize it as you would any kind of tablet, phone, touchscreen. Very responsive generally to manipulating the models, and I guess similarly just as natural as it would be using the Complete Anatomy, but you're just getting much higher resolution cadaveric images as part of this software. And the table itself is a bit kind of versatile in where it can be deployed, as it can be positioned vertically or horizontally. So you can see It's horizontally here like it would be as if you'd approached a donor on a table in a cadaveric lab, but it can also be positioned vertically as well, so it would be more kind of like a whiteboard teaching experience, as it were. So here you can just see kind of the example of how you can deploy the Anatomage table. So it's definitely not a small resource, it is quite large. I believe this table itself is probably about 6 foot in length, so a couple of meters. It's you definitely need to have space for it, but you can see here that you can either have it horizontally or vertically, depending on your space and the needs and how you're going to be conducting your teaching. But again, same with Complete Anatomy, it's not a perfect software, it's not a perfect kind of virtual learning experience either. The software itself is very, very complex. Kind of a drawback, I guess, of being so feature rich is that it has a very steep learning curve. There are an awful lot of options, and it really does take some time and concerted effort to figure out how to use it. And depending how you're going to be utilizing it in your teaching can be a bit of a problem. From my own experience using it, we had very short sessions of about 40 to 50 minutes with students a couple of times a term, where I would facilitate their learning using an Anatomage table. And it was quite difficult for the students to kind of, jump into the session, get the hang of the software, utilize it effectively. So a lot of the sessions were students and myself figuring out how to show the bits of anatomy that they wanted to see, how to utilize the different features, figuring out what features there were, because it is just so deep. So it will actually take quite a while to really get the table kind of achieving its full potential, really, as a teaching instrument. Something else as well, because these images are so higher resolution, and because you're rendering so many of them three-dimensionally, constantly, basically, every time you rotate the model, you're basically having to re-render these images. It is incredibly hardware intensive, which is why it's needed as its own kind of equipment, its own resource, and that needs to be maintained. What can happen is, as the software gets updated, I believe they're on version 8 now of the table, it gets more and more intensive. Every leap in technology, every leap in software is going to warrant basically some sort of upgrade. Eventually it's going to get to a point where like any computer, any phone, I'm sure you've had a phone that's been more than 2 to 3 years old and it starts to run a little bit slower. And that is going to happen, unfortunately, with any kind of technological learning resource. And the Anatomage table, unfortunately, isn't exempt from that. So that needs to be maintained and is a consideration for the longevity of its use as a learning resource. It also can be quite slow. Again, just because of how hardware intensive it is, because of the high level of kind of computational power that is needed and the level of detail in these images, transitioning from model to model can take quite a while because it's having to do so much as far as rendering these images. And that can be quite difficult when you're in a teaching environment, if there's a lot of stop and start, kind of transitioning from one model to another. So it is just something that needs to be planned ahead of time and prepared for as much as possible. You really need to have your kind of whole teaching session planned and prepared on the table. Otherwise, you will end up spending a lot of time kind of waiting for loading and just for the kind of the table to catch up to what you're asking it to do. It is also a little restrictive in its teaching style. With Complete Anatomy, because that can be deployed on any number of tablets, other bits of hardware, it's very easy to just let everyone kind of follow along with a teaching activity using that software, or be presenting from the front, kind of casting that software, that screen somewhere. I've used it in lecture theatres or in the lab an awful lot, sharing my screen so that everyone can view it. Unfortunately, the Anatomage table, it's a little bit more tricky than that, because it's kind of confined to this table. It could be cast with you know, a little bit of kind of technological know-how, could be cast or streamed to other screens. But as far as actually teaching around the table as a resource, you are then quite restricted to smaller groups. Basically, you're only going to be able to teach as many people as can comfortably fit around that table. And especially as we start thinking about how we teach in the pandemic and still kind of trying to maintain some social distancing, smaller groups are very common. And so it is a little bit restrictive in as how efficiently you can teach larger numbers, and that is just something to bear in mind. And lastly, I talked a little bit about the cost of complete anatomy. Anatomage is considerably more of an investment. The table itself has to be purchased in order to use the software, as far as I understand, and this is in the tens of thousands of pounds range, so it is something that does need to be heavily considered as an investment for your institution. I wouldn't be recommending students go out and buy one for themselves, whereas comparatively, on an individual basis, something like Complete or some of the other software options might be a lot more accessible financially. So that is just something to bear in mind. And then some of the extended reality options. A lot of the softwares that I've talked about actually have these already built in. So if you remember, with extended reality, we're talking about virtual and augmented. So if you look on the right here, this is a video I took through Complete Anatomy, so you can see we have a beating heart model here, and if you look down on the right, there's an AR mode button, which I just tapped. Basically what that does is it puts the software into an augmented reality mode. So here, this is my kitchen counter. You can see that the camera is scanning for a flat surface. I tap on that flat surface, and then it populates that area with an augmented reality view of the model that I was just viewing. So you can see now it's fixed that in the space of my kitchen counter. I can move around that model and have a look at it three-dimensionally in the space that I'm in. You can see I can add my hand in for a sense of scale and things like that. This could be used on top of anatomical models that you already have in your teaching spaces. You can see the model is still fully manipulable. I can rotate it to get a different view if the space restrains me from walking around it, or if I'm mobility impaired. But I can still get that same level of functionality. Tapping on an area tells me exactly what it is. And that's something that personally I haven't been able to use a massive amount in my teaching, simply based on the spaces within which I teach, which often contain cadaveric material, so the use of cameras is prohibited pertaining to the Human Tissue Act and other legal requirements like that. But in classroom environments, this is quite an interesting way of being able to teach the anatomy. It's something very different, especially when you're trying to get people interested in the topic. This has that kind of cool factor to it, which might be, able to capture kind of the imagination of students and give them a bit more of that active kind of learning, kind of giving them kind of, that closer to the anatomy experience rather than just looking at, a 2D image in a book. Giving them something that, inhabits their reality is something that might kind of pique their interest a little bit more. Obviously, there are other options available. Anatomage do have some sort of extended reality option, which is basically their own tablet piece of hardware, which creates what's called a stereoscopic 3D image. So this is kind of basically the image looks 3D on the tablet. It doesn't require glasses or anything like that. Basically, this tablet has been made so that it creates an image that looks like it's, protruding from the screen. Very cool technology again, but again is its own kind of self-contained piece of hardware and software that you would have to purchase with the view of only using that. Whereas some of these other options like Complete Anatomy with the integrated AR, and then some of these VR options, which are actually just available to be bought through the Steam store, which, just if you're not aware, Steam is basically kind of the Apple store, but for games, on generally available on PC or on computers. So that's the way that a lot of these VR anatomy softwares are made available. So basically you would purchase them or download them from the Steam store onto a capable PC or Mac or whatever system you have that has the suitable requirements for it. And then for 3D Organon, you would require to purchase an annual subscription to their software, which comes at various levels depending on the hardware that you're using it on, whether it's on a PC, on a standalone VR headset, things like that. So there are multiple options, again, as this kind of whole area of virtual reality and virtual dissection experiences keeps increasing. So why even bother kind of using this virtual dissection in general? It's still a fairly new technology, so it's very important to think about whether or not it's worth adapting. And there's multiple reasons why we are doing across the board kind of in different medical education institutions. And kind of one of the biggest benefits to using virtual dissection, I think, is the improved accessibility. It just makes it so much more possible for everyone, depending on which option you go with. Any of these options that are simply apps, so the Complete Anatomies, Anatomy TVs of the world, as long as you have a suitable piece of hardware, a tablet, a capable computer with a web browser, then you can have access to it. Depending on the financial side can be different, but for instance at Brighton and Sussex, we're very lucky that the institution has purchased a license. So that means that we can provide this kind of virtual dissection experience to all of our students completely free. We simply give them the institutional license code, they download the app, sign in, use that code, and then for their time at the university, they will have access to that resource. It also means that anybody that potentially isn't able to access the lab for whatever reason means that they can still have as best a dissection experience as they possibly could. Again, regardless of the software, they're basically able to still have that kind of immersive anatomical learning experience, looking at the structures three-dimensionally or as much as possible in that kind of learning environment and get that same level of knowledge from it without necessarily having to be in the lab. Whether that's mobility issues, if there's any pregnant individuals who are worried about kind of exposure to formalin or any other laboratory chemicals like that, which feeds into the safety aspect of it as well. Using a virtual dissection table, even if you look at the image on the right here, you can see this is a very involved teaching experience. So you can see that they're kind of utilizing the table to look at some cadaveric images here and finding pulse points, giving you that kind of concrete anatomical landmarks. But that's a lot safer than having to kind of be in a lab and dissect down to view these cadaveric areas, or at least this kind of image of a cadaveric human. There's no issues with sharp injuries. Again, there's no issues of spills with chemicals, being in a lab environment. And it's just a lot, again, feeding into that safety and accessibility thing. It's just a lot easier for students to get a similar experience without any real risks being associated with it. And as well, just from an academic kind of learning theory point of view, it helps to maintain that more active experiential learning kind of methodology, just giving students something to do. If they're going through the app, exploring the anatomy, using the table, seeing these images, seeking out the areas of anatomy that they need to know about, it basically helps them to learn it a bit easier rather than simply trying to passively instill that knowledge within themselves by reading books. Or listening to a lecture. It's the kind of the learning by doing theory a little bit more, which for a lot of students is massively helpful. It can be really difficult for a lot of students to maintain that level of concentration when the information is just kind of being given to them, but when they're seeking it out, sometimes in a lot of students that can actually help it to kind of cement itself a lot more, and it gives them a lot more independence as well, which I think is very important as we look at kind of helping them to become better learners in the long run. There's a lot of potential cost benefits as well. Whilst there are still costs to be incurred, and they're not insubstantial, and they are still quite high, but benefits nonetheless. I imagine, I don't have the exact numbers, but paying for an institutional license for complete or buying an Anatomage table eventually will be much more financially viable than maintaining an entire cadaveric lab. Some institutions may not be able to afford financially or even space to have a full cadaveric lab. The time to set that up, make sure it's safe, well ventilated, that constant turnover of donors, achieving the donors in the first place, this is all very, very difficult, and I applaud anyone that is currently able to maintain a cadaveric lab, because it is no mean feat whatsoever. So having virtual dissection as an option may be kind of the easiest or the only way that some institutions can provide a dissection experience to their students. So whilst it is still a big financial undertaking, it is something to be considered that it might have a potential cost benefit. And then one of the last things to think about is that using virtual dissection might actually be preferable to a lot of students. There is quite a lot of research around the emotional difficulties that students experience going through cadaveric dissection as a part of their studies, and it is substantial. Not only in the first instance, a lot of students, from my own experience, do find it very difficult to adjust to that environment. I know personally I did for a time when I was first a student undertaking cadaveric dissection, and using virtual options, or at least offering virtual options, can help to kind of navigate around that difficulty. Even if it's just from time to time, sometimes students have grievances, and it can make being in a lab environment with cadaveric specimens very difficult. So even if it's simply for one session, so the student doesn't miss that level or that portion of the teaching, giving them a virtual dissection experience to supplement or in some cases maybe even replace part of the teaching can be very beneficial. But it's not a perfect kind of solution. It's not going to completely replace cadaveric dissection. I really don't think it should. I think it's a fantastic supplement, but it doesn't give everything that cadaveric dissection does, which is why so many medical institutions are still keeping up with offering cadaveric dissection. Kind of the largest, most notable difference is that it doesn't offer any kind of tactile feedback to the anatomy. There's no kind of haptic experience to the learning there. The students aren't able to get an idea for how the anatomy feels, the different types of tissues, which is sometimes very helpful. Some students really do benefit from, again, that more active and hands-on learning experience, and I think it's something to bear in mind how wide the different learning styles will be from student to student, and this is something that will be lacking in a virtual dissection experience. And then moving forward, as they move into their clinical careers, if they haven't done any cadaveric dissection, they won't have the same level of skill using operating tools. It will have just been a thing that was missing kind of from their education, unless they took it upon themselves to either seek out this kind of experience or practice these kinds of things in their more clinical skills-based areas of teaching, but that still wouldn't kind of span to actually dissecting human material, which for some students might be a massive disappointment as well, especially those looking to move further down towards a surgical career path. This is something that attracts a lot of students to medical institutions if they know that there is going to be cadaveric dissection offered. So thinking kind of moving even further forward as we kind of virtual dissection becomes more robust, becomes more integrated into the kind of the teaching environments. It is now being looked at as how it can be used to teach at a higher level. So moving even further from kind of these undergraduate medics and moving into now how it can be used to help train surgeons. And hopefully it's very apparent that it is still a great educational tool. Regardless of your level of in your career, you will still need to learn anatomy if you're in a clinical area, and these educational tools are fantastic for that. Whether it's learning an area of anatomy from scratch or simply dipping back in to refresh your memory a little bit more, this is going to be an incredibly good resource for you to be able to do that. And I think it definitely should be looked at as a long-standing kind of career teaching resource, because again it just makes it a lot more accessible, and is going to give you very accurate representations of the anatomy, and it can be instant. Doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing, as long as you have a capable device with you, you can then use it to, learn that piece of the anatomy that you need to. But not want to stop simply at what we have. There are now virtual reality surgical training courses being offered. One, for instance, which we actually have hosted at Brighton and Sussex a number of times, is VRIMS. This is the Virtual Reality in Medicine and Surgery course, which has been gathering a lot of steam, really. It's becoming an increasingly popular course in kind of how it's being utilised. And you can see on the image on the right here, this is kind of an example of the setup that will be offered. So you can see all of these different images being offered here. So you can see in the top right, this is a 360 camera that's being used to record the area, and then we have multiple other cameras placed within the room around kind of the relevant training model in this case. So VRIMS, taking that as an example again because it's one of the few that I have first-hand experience with, the whole idea behind this is that by allowing surgeons to attend a surgical training course through virtual reality, is that it just again adds to that level of accessibility, and it's got an incredibly wide range of potential applications which they talk about. So medical education, as I said, at any level of your career, you're still going to need to learn things, and this is going to be one of the ways that they can reach students, fully trained clinicians, surgeons, all alike, by offering them the opportunity to attend these courses. It's a very kind of interesting way of being able to display new clinical techniques, surgical procedures, and instrument setup, basically because it will put the attendee in the room. They don't have to travel. It gives them a very unique kind of viewpoint for these training opportunities, kind of incorporating this whole 360 simulation, whether it be cadaveric dissection or any of these other options. But depending on how the room is set up, as you saw, we had a multiple camera setup. So we have a 360 degree camera, so that will basically make the individual feel as if they are stood in the actual room where the training is happening. And if they're wearing this headset, they can be fully immersed in that room. No matter where they turn, they will be able to see what is going on in that room, which is one of the benefits of having these 360 degree cameras. So again, fully immersing them within that training space. Also, what it can do is it can give almost like a first-person view from the trainer. As long as they are wearing a camera, we have GoPros which we use quite readily in our lab. If that is worn by the trainer, that gives a first-person view to whether it's kind of if they're setting up an instrument, the individual viewing through the VR headset will be able to see how the individual is doing that incredibly clearly, which kind of gets around that difficulty of having to get everyone in a room. As you can see here, I've talked about that it's increasing the access, not only geographically, but as well just the sheer number of people. So it doesn't matter where these people are. We recently had a training course, which I believe was attended largely from a group in Uganda. And it didn't matter that they were that far away. The fact that we had an internet connection that was stable enough, and as did they, meant that they were perfectly able to access it. Speaking to the organizer, all they really need someone to have in order to attend these courses is a stable internet connection, a device through which to view video, so whether that be a phone or a computer or a tablet, and then a virtual reality headset, which can be purchased for as little as £10. There are many virtual reality headsets now, for instance, one of which is called Google Cardboard, which is basically almost like an origami VR headset. Comes in a flat package, and you basically fold it into create this virtual reality headset, and then you insert your phone into the front, and then you can use that as a virtual reality headset. And then you're ready to attend or consume whatever virtual reality content you want. And this can be offered to any number of participants because, again, if you're attending a surgical training experience and you're all trying to crowd around kind of one, piece of equipment, one area of anatomy that's being operated on, there's only a certain amount of people allowed in that physical space, whereas using this kind of virtual reality setup bypasses that entirely, and as many people as have those three things that are needed to attend, all of them can. So again, it's massively increasing that level of accessibility, just helping new techniques to be kind of passed on, and just kind of globalizing, I guess, that level of surgical training, and making sure that all of the newest techniques are being kind of passed on to as many people as possible. And so that's everything really that I have to say for today. So again, just to summarize, virtual dissection is becoming increasingly popular and accessible as far as it being a teaching resource, meaning more people can access it. It's incredibly safe. We're removing a lot of the risk of cadaveric dissection, and giving it a lot more versatility as far as where and how it can be deployed, and how it's able to be engaged with. And it's spanning not only undergraduate and postgraduate university training and study, but is now actually being looked at as training clinicians as well. However, it's not going to completely replace cadaveric dissection, and I don't think it should. It's still going to incur a lot of high costs, depending on which route you go down, whether it's a kind of one large cost as a kind of initial adoption fee, or it's still going to have kind of maintenance costs, especially if you're looking at subscription services and the like. And it will never be able really, or at least not currently, never say never, but isn't currently able to replicate that tactile learning experience that dissection offers. But it is a fantastic learning tool that I think it should be looked at, and hopefully maybe this has kind of inspired you to either maybe look at it for your own learning, or perhaps even explore it a little bit for as far as a resource that you would be able to provide at your institution for your students. So thank you very, very much for listening, and I want to say a massive thank you to the committee as well for not only organising the whole conference, but as well for inviting me to come and talk. It was an absolute pleasure, and I feel very honoured to be asked to do so. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to contact me, or if you even just have any feedback, you can get in touch with me here at my email address. I'm also contactable on Twitter if you use it, at Domothy O'Brien. Or if you have any feedback that you would, or comments or anything that you would like to give anonymously, just because you don't feel comfortable adding a name to it, that is perfectly fine. If you have a copy of the slides, you can follow this link here, or alternatively, you can simply scan this QR code, and that will take you to a questionnaire that I've used for my teaching before. Feel free to fill in all the relevant portions that you want, but it will just be completely anonymous if there is anything that you would like for me to know. So again, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed this talk and all of the rest of the ones, and I hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.